Imagine walking through a silent forest in Poland's countryside, where the mist creeps among the trees like a veil of forgotten souls. Beneath your feet, the earth conceals secrets that defy even the bounds of fear. Ancient graves where the deceased were buried with scythes pressed against their necks, stones crushing their chests, or stakes driven through their hearts. These are not ordinary graves. They are prisons. Prisons for something that, according to the beliefs of that time, should never again surface. These unusual burials were discovered in remote villages and archaeological excavation sites, and they immediately drew attention for the same reason. Everything about them screams ancestral terror. But what drove medieval peasants to treat corpses with such dread? What haunted their nights to the extent that they deemed these grotesque precautions necessary? Were these people considered witches, condemned by some curse? Or was there something even darker behind the blades and stones, the specter of an evil that would not perish with the flesh? In this video, we will descend into the depths of one of the most macabre discoveries in medieval archaeology, the so-called vampire graves in Poland. We will immerse ourselves in forgotten legends, pagan beliefs, religious terrors, and mysteries that defy logical explanation. And in the end, you will decide, were these merely superstitious rituals, or the real traces of something that history tried to bury, but which the earth insists on remembering? The first shovel that pierces the dry soil rarely warns of what it will unearth. In various archaeological sites across Poland, excavations that seemed routine revealed something that sent shivers down even the most skeptical researchers. Skeletons arranged in deliberately disturbing ways, with evident signs that the living wanted to ensure the eternal silence of the dead. One of the most emblematic locations is the village of Drawsko in northern Poland. There, archaeologists discovered graves dating from the 17th and 18th centuries containing female bodies buried, with scythes placed in strategic positions, crossed over the neck or under the waist. Others had enormous stones pressing down on the skull or chest, and in some cases, the bodies were decapitated. The scythes, far from being merely symbolic, had a clear purpose. If the deceased tried to rise, they would immediately be beheaded or sliced apart. The fear of the dead returning was as literal as it was brutal. These were not hasty burials of criminals or war victims. They were carefully prepared interments. The graves had a Christian orientation, indicating that these individuals were part of the community, and yet they were treated as supernatural threats. The presence of coins beneath the body, personal belongings, or remnants of clothing shows that despite the terror, a ritual was still in progress. This contrast makes the whole scenario even more chilling. They had been loved in life and feared in death. Another significant find occurred in the city of Gliwice in the Silesian region. In 2013, excavators uncovered skeletons with the head positioned between the knees or completely separated from the body. Decapitation was a common practice against those suspected of witchcraft, but also against those considered undead, individuals who, according to folklore, might return as vampires or revenants. Decapitation and removal of the heart were extreme containment measures. It was not merely punishment, it was a defensive mechanism. But why such fear? And why did it manifest in such physical and violent ways? Poland, like many regions in Central and Eastern Europe, was a melting pot of pagan and Christian beliefs, where fear of the dead was cultivated from time immemorial. The belief that some of the deceased could rise from their graves to torment the living spanned generations, especially during times of plague, famine, or social disorder. Any inexplicable death, a series of illnesses, or a natural disaster could be attributed to the action of a vengeful dead. Archaeologists, of course, offer more rational hypotheses. Some suggest that those buried with these practices were outsiders, victims of poorly understood diseases, or individuals with eccentric behavior. Others believe that some of these practices may have been symbolic, a way to mark marginality or reinforce community control. But these explanations, though plausible, do not erase the ritualistic and fear-laden element that each grave exudes. In a particularly disturbing case, a body was found with a stone forced deep into the mouth, a practice that appears in several regions of Europe. This action symbolized silencing the dead so that they could not call others to death or prevent them from feeding on the vital breath of the living. It is an image that transcends archaeology and touches directly on ancestral terror. The fear that death is not the end, but the beginning of a curse. Another notable element is the presence of iron objects, such as scythes and nails, often associated with protection against evil. Iron, in popular symbolism, was considered a material with purifying properties and repellent to malign forces. Placing a scythe beneath the neck was not just a trap, it was a mystical seal, an exorcism in blade form. The discoveries in these Polish graves shed light on a period when the line between the natural and the supernatural was tenuous. Diseases, like the plague, which spread invisibly and killed indiscriminately, fueled fears of curses and contaminating dead. In times of medical ignorance, the vampire was as plausible an explanation as any other. But there is something even more unsettling. The fact that these practices were socially accepted, carried out methodically, and even solemnly, shows that the fear was not irrational. It was collective, deeply rooted, normative. Rather than isolated aberrations, the graves of the vampires represent a worldview in which the threat could come not only from the unseen, but also from those who had already departed. These excavations reveal more than just bones. They reveal an ancestral pact between the living and the dead, a pact based on terror, superstition, and a desperate attempt to maintain order in a universe where chaos always lurked. And perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is to realize that even in the face of death, humans still fear what they cannot see and cannot control. Long before black cloaks, sharp fangs, and Transylvanian castles, the vampire was a creature of silence and distrust, a whisper among peasants, a name unspoken after nightfall. The image of the medieval vampire was less theatrical and far more visceral, an invisible force that drained the life from the living through glances, dreams, and inexplicable illnesses. And it is within this primitive spectre, far more feared than understood, that the graves of Drasko and other Polish sites fit. In Eastern European folklore, especially in Slavic regions, vampires were figures deeply rooted in popular belief. They were not necessarily elegant aristocrats, but rather restless dead, corpses that failed to decompose as expected, or those that displayed strange signs after burial. It was enough for someone to die suddenly, in isolation, or under suspicious circumstances for the village's fear of their return to grip the community. And any other misfortune that followed that burial, be it drought, epidemic, or a bout of madness, was seen as proof that something had come back. Descriptions of these beings varied. In some traditions, the vampire was a bloated, reddened corpse, with open eyes and inflamed skin, not a skeleton, but a sort of living dead creature brimming with blood, which fed the notion that it feasted during dark nights. In other versions, the vampire was invisible, a dark spirit that only brought death from afar, never actually seen. These conceptions did not arise from nowhere. They were reinforced by ordinary yet terrifying occurrences. For instance, when a body was exhumed and appeared not to have decomposed, it was seen as an unmistakable sign of vampirism. In reality, natural phenomena such as slow decomposition in cold or damp soils were poorly understood. The swelling of bodies, the blood that sometimes emerged from the nostrils or mouth, all were interpreted as post-mortem activity, as if the corpse were feeding To contain these unwelcome dead, apotropaic practices, that is, rituals of protection, emerged. They included burying the body face down, removing the heart, cutting off the head, driving stakes through the chest, burning the remains, or, as in the Polish cases, placing scythes and stones. The belief was simple: to prevent movement, block the vital breath, and spiritually seal the body. These practices, seen today as bizarre, were desperate measures by a population struggling to understand and survive in a brutal, mysterious world. Curiously, not all those treated as vampires were considered malign in life. In some legends, they were people who died tragically, or individuals marked from birth, such as those born with teeth, with a membrane on the face, or on days deemed cursed. Others were foreigners, unbaptized, or victims of violent deaths. Death outside the norm was always a trigger for fear. The Catholic Church, though officially opposed to these beliefs, had an ambivalent relationship with the phenomenon. At many times, priests preferred to ignore or tolerate these practices, especially in more isolated villages, where popular superstition was stronger than any ecclesiastical doctrine. In other cases, the Church would attempt to incorporate the fear of vampires as yet another proof of divine punishment, associating them with restless souls or unredeemed sinners. Polish folklore offers fascinating accounts of creatures called upior or wampierze, terms used to describe restless dead with vampiric traits. These beings could change shape, invade houses at night, and feed on blood or vital energy. In some versions, merely crossing paths with an upior was enough to fall ill, waste away, or lose one's mind. These stories were passed down orally from generation to generation, woven with fear and reverence. And more than supernatural explanations, they functioned as social regulators. The fear of the vampire kept communities vigilant, imposed behavioral norms, and reinforced the idea that even death had rules. Otherwise, the corpse would not rest, and something far worse could occur. But perhaps the darkest aspect of this belief is its psychological power. The medieval vampire did not need to be seen to incite panic. Its threat was felt in absences, in the child who falls ill without reason, in the milk that suddenly sours, in disturbing dreams, in the invisible weight that chokes the chest at night. The vampire was the embodiment of trauma, unresolved grief, the fear of contamination. And its imprisonment in the grave, done with stones, scythes, stakes, or fire, was a desperate attempt to contain the unspeakable. In many villages, carrying out the second burial of a vampire required nighttime ceremonies, invocation of folk healers, inverted prayers, and even offerings. It was not just reburial, it was a negotiation with the invisible forces governing death. Sometimes the heart of the dead was burned, and its ashes mixed in water to be drunk by the sick. At other times, the remains were cast into rivers, for running water was seen as a spiritual barrier. These practices reveal a symbolic universe in which the vampire is more than a monster. It is a mirror of human fear. Fear of that which escapes, control, fear of death that does not end, fear that evil is eternal. In the graves of Poland, these beliefs take on concrete form. The scythes, the stones, the bodies violated even after death, all bear witness to a world in which the supernatural was real, tangible, part of everyday life. A world in which every death was accompanied by vigilance, suspicion, and rituals. Because death at that time did not signify just an end, it could mark the start of something even more terrible. When modern archaeologists come across graves sealed with scythes, heads separated from the body, and stones forced into the mouths of the dead, the initial reaction is one of bewilderment. But it does not take long for fascination with the macabre to give way to attempts at rational explanation. After all, we live in an age guided by science, and it demands answers that do not involve the supernatural. Yet the vampire graves in Poland seem to resist simple explanations, as if they harbor an echo that reason hesitates to dissipate completely. From an archaeological standpoint, the funeral practices found in these graves are interpreted as cultural strategies. Rather than proofs of vampirism, they may signify social exclusion, stigmatization, or fear of the unknown. Those interred with these rituals might have died suddenly, or provoked fear through their behavior in life. Mental illness, deformities, epilepsy, or simply being an outsider was enough for someone to be deemed different and dangerous. Another line of thought points to outbreaks of plague and contagious diseases that ravaged European villages. In despairing times, when no one understood how viruses or bacteria worked, the hunt for culprits was inevitable. The most recent dead, especially those whose bodies appeared too well preserved, became objects of suspicion. A corpse without visible signs of decomposition could be interpreted as too alive. In this context, the scythe was a preventive guarantee against a possible return. But even among scientists, there is consensus that these explanations, though logical, do not exhaust the mystery. There is a symbolic, almost ritualistic element that transcends the immediate fear of contagion or social exclusion. The care taken with the positioning of objects, the choice of materials, the repetition of certain funeral gestures point to something deeper, a structured belief, a cosmology of fear expressed through ritual violence. Moreover, Poland's historical context adds layers of complexity. During the period when many of these graves were dated, the country was a cultural and religious mosaic. Christian beliefs coexisted with pagan traditions, superstition, and popular mythology, forming a dense network of meanings. It is no exaggeration to say that people of that time lived simultaneously in two worlds: the visible, governed by human laws, and the invisible, where spirits, curses, and nameless horrors dwelled. The constant presence of iron, especially in the form of scythes and nails, has been the subject of study. Iron was seen as a metal with the power to protect against malevolent entities. Its use in these graves cannot be reduced to a simple symbolic gesture. It carries the intent to seal, to sever any link between the realm of the dead and that of the living. It is both an amulet and a weapon. Curiously, some discoveries show that not all those deemed dangerous in death were treated with hostility. In certain graves, there is evidence that the person was buried with personal belongings, jewelry, or coins, signs that they were respected in life. This creates an almost tragic tension. They were loved, and yet feared. And even after death, the community did not know whether to mourn their departure or to watch over their grave in fear. Science, however precise it tries to be, faces a dilemma. How does one measure fear? How does one catalog the sacred or the accursed? What lies behind the act of driving a stake through a chest or placing a stone in a mouth that no longer speaks? These gestures, archaic as they may seem, originate from a place that modern reason rarely reaches, the heart of symbolic terror. Some scholars are beginning to recognize that these graves, more than offering answers, pose uncomfortable questions. They challenge the narrative of linear progress, where knowledge dispels ignorance. On the contrary, they show that, even surrounded by rituals, the living of the past were as lost in the face of death as we are today. Their tools were different, their beliefs more explicit, but the fear of the unknown is the same. And it is precisely at this point that science and the supernatural meet. Because in trying to explain the vampire graves, we are not merely interpreting the past. We are confronting our own ghosts. The fear that death is not the end, that something might escape the clutches of decay, that evil might don the skin of those we love and return. Therefore, perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not what these graves reveal about the past, but what they whisper about us. Because while archaeologists dig into the ground seeking answers, the shadows emerging from these pits seem to say, "You too fear the night, even in the light of reason." There is something primitive and irrepressible in the fear of the dead returning. It is not simply a fantasy or a cultural superstition, it is an impulse that traverses civilizations, religions, and centuries. The vampire graves in Poland, with their macabre containment rituals, are the physical reflection of this ancestral dread. But why, after all, do we fear so much that the dead rise? What exactly haunts us when we imagine a corpse breaking, the soil to return? The return of the dead represents, in essence, the rupture of natural order. The cycle of life and death is the invisible axis that underpins our understanding of the world. When this cycle is threatened, the very concept of reality fragments. The Walking Dead is not merely a moving body, it is a symbol of chaos, of unatoned guilt, of transgression that has not been forgotten, and perhaps most disturbing, of trauma that refuses to die. In many cultures, fear of the dead's return connects to notions of incomplete justice, spiritual vengeance, or unredeemed sin. The returning dead is the one who could not rest. And this unrest may be caused by a poorly conducted funeral, an unrepaired injustice, or an unfulfilled pact. Thus, the medieval vampire can be read as a reflection of collective conscience, a disturbed soul spurred by human actions. Its return is not random. It carries a message, a somber reminder that certain wrongs cannot be interred with the flesh. But there is also fear of contagion. In times of plague, death spread invisibly and devastatingly. No one knew precisely how disease passed from one body to another. The idea that the dead could harbor a malevolent or destructive force was as plausible as any medical theory of the time. Thus, the corpse became a continuous threat, a presence that even buried needed to be watched, mutilated, contained. Death, in itself, is difficult to grasp. It is absence, silence, transformation. But the dead who return to life is even more unbearable, for it exposes the fear that death is not the end, but merely a precarious pause in a story we do not control. And what lies beyond that threshold? If graves are not final, what else can cross the barrier between worlds? Even today, in the 21st century, popular culture is infused with narratives about returning dead. Zombies, ghosts, modern vampires, they are but recycled versions of the same archetype. This demonstrates that the fear of the dead's return did not vanish with the progress of science. It merely changed form. Technology can explain bodily functions, but it does not dissolve the anguish of losing someone, nor the terror that absence might transform into an unwanted presence. In the Polish graves, the echoes of the damned still vibrate. Each scythe, each stone upon the chest, each head separated from its body tells a story of terror and a desperate attempt at control. These rituals were not solely for the protection of the living. They were also a cry in the face of the unfathomable mystery of existence, the desire to close a door that should never be opened. In the end, we fear the dead's return because deep down, we fear that death is not merely a full stop, but an uncertain comma in a story beyond our control. And as long as that fear persists, while the shadow of the past lurks around our certainties, the dead will continue to haunt us, not because they seek to return, but because perhaps they never truly left. Amidst the silent fields of Poland lie corpses that, even centuries later, continue to stare at us with invisible eyes. The scythes across their necks, the stones in their mouths, and their severed heads are not just signs of fear, they are testimonies of a dark pact between the living and the dead. A pact forged with blood, steel, and silence. The vampire graves speak of a time when the unknown was not denied, but confronted with rituals, when death was an active, dangerous entity, perhaps even conscious. And although modern science attempts to reframe these gestures as socio-cultural responses, something deeper continues to pulse beneath the earth. A warning, perhaps, an echo. These graves do not merely inter bodies. They bury anguish, trauma, and fears that survive the passage of time. They remind us that no matter how far humanity advances, there are questions that remain open, like poorly sealed graves. Today, standing before these deliberately sealed burials, we ask ourselves, exactly what did they fear? And more importantly, did they do enough to prevent the return? If these rituals teach us anything, it is that the fear of the past continues to haunt us. And perhaps we have never stopped looking over our shoulder, afraid of hearing footsteps behind us, coming from beneath the earth. If you enjoyed this descent into the shadows, please like, share, and follow the channel. Until our next descent into the shadows of history.